A dozen sample containers come up from beneath the Antarctic ice, and none of them go into an ordinary freezer. They are sealed, quarantined, and handled under contamination protocols closer to what surrounds a live pathogen than a scoop of meltwater. The stated reason is caution. What sits inside them is the question. In 2013, researchers studying ice refrozen from Lake Vostok, a lake sealed under nearly 4 kilometers of ice for millions of years, reported genetic sequences that matched nothing cleanly in the catalogue of known life. Some sat around 86% similar to bacteria and no closer. That is not a new species so much as a new branch. Here is where ordinary science quietly turns strange, and no one has to lie for it to happen. NASA and astrobiologists study these buried Antarctic lakes on purpose, not only for what lives on Earth, but as stand-ins for the frozen oceans of Europa and Enceladus. The continent is, in plain terms, a rehearsal ground for finding alien life. So set the pieces beside one another. Organisms that fit no known branch of life, pulled from the most remote and restricted points on the planet, handled by the very institutions preparing for the discovery of something extraterrestrial. And once the ice is gone and the thing is thawing in a sealed room, what, one reading asks, is actually being done to it? Start with the version that requires no villains, because it is genuinely reasonable. When you drill through 4 kilometers of ancient ice into water that has been sealed since before there were primates, the greatest danger is you. Every glove, every seal, every quarantine exists to keep our microbes out of that water. This is called planetary protection, and it is ordinary science, not intrigue. The same institutions that plan Mars missions apply the same logic downward into the ice. A sample that fits no known branch of life is treated carefully, not because it is a monster, but because a contaminated result would ruin decades of work. And the study of these lakes has a stated, published purpose. Subglacial Antarctic water, dark, cold, cut off from the sun, pressurized under ice, is one of the closest environments on Earth to the oceans thought to lie beneath the ice shells of Europa and Enceladus. NASA studies Antarctica as a rehearsal for finding life elsewhere. So the official picture is coherent, and I want you to hold it honestly. Scientists drill into buried lakes, handle the samples with extreme care, and use those environments to prepare for astrobiology. Nothing in that sentence requires a cover-up. Most of what happens down there really is just careful, unglamorous work. Keep that firmly in mind. Now the first crack, and it is a small one. In 2013, a Russian team studying ice refrozen from Lake Vostok reported a bacterial signature they could not place, something they described as less than 86% similar to any organism in the genetic databases. They gave it a label, not a name. 86% is the part that lingers. 2 humans share more than 99% of their DNA. You and a mushroom share more than that 86 figure across the genes that matter most, a number that low does not describe a cousin of known life. It describes something standing far outside the family tree entirely. I want to be careful here, because there is an obvious counter-explanation, and it is a strong one. The Vostok borehole was drilled using thousands of litres of kerosene and freon as drilling fluid. Contamination is not a paranoid worry. It is the leading, sober explanation most microbiologists reached for immediately. That matters. Other researchers said exactly that. The strange sequence, they argued, was likely a contaminant, something introduced by the drilling itself, or an artifact of an incomplete database that simply had not catalogued that organism yet. Matches nothing often just means not sequenced yet. I find that explanation reasonable. I genuinely do. And yet the same shape keeps appearing in different water, drilled by different people on different parts of the continent. That is the thing I cannot make sit quietly. Once you notice the pattern, you start seeing it not as one anomaly, but as a habit the continent seems to have. Let me show you what I mean. In 2013, a separate American project, a US team, different equipment, different lake, drilled into subglacial Lake Whillans, hundreds of kilometers away. They found a living microbial ecosystem thriving in total darkness beneath the ice, feeding on minerals, entirely cut off from the world above. Life where the official expectation had been something closer to nothing. Then there is Lake Vida, sealed under ice, its brine isolated for thousands of years, hosting bacteria that survive in conditions that should be lethal. Each of these is, on its own, a legitimate scientific triumph. Nobody hid them. But notice the accumulation. Every time we open the ice, something is waiting that we did not expect. One reading of this, and I want to flag it clearly as a reading, a theory, not a fact, is that Antarctica is not a dead archive of frozen water. It is a reservoir of biology that developed along lines that never touched ours, isolated for millions of years, evolving or persisting in the dark, untaxonomied, unnamed. And if that reservoir exists, then the sealed containers and the quarantine protocols start to look different. The care is real either way. But the theory asks a colder question. When you have retrieved an organism that fits no branch of the tree of life, and you are the agency preparing to recognize alien biology, what do you do with it next? You study it, you test it, you experiment. Return to the geography now, because it is stranger than people admit. Of every place on a continent larger than the United States, the Soviets chose to build a permanent year-round station at the pole of inaccessibility's neighbour, the single coldest recorded point on Earth, where the temperature once fell below -89 degrees Celsius. Why plant a flag in the most hostile spot imaginable? The reasonable answer is that Vostok sits atop the thickest ice, ideal for deep ice core climate records, and near the geomagnetic South Pole, useful for atmospheric science. Both true, both published. I am not pretending those reasons are inventions, but sit with the coincidence. The most inaccessible station also sits above the most isolated body of unknown water. Convenient or chosen. You could dismiss it as accident. Ice cores need thick ice caps, deep lakes. The two overlap for boring physical reasons. That is probably the whole story. I keep telling myself, that is probably the whole story. But the theory does not need the location to be sinister. It only needs the pattern of secrecy that surrounds what comes out of it. Because here is what genuinely unsettles me, and it is not aliens. In December 2012, a British team attempting to drill into another buried lake, subglacial Lake Ellsworth, failed. Equipment problems, they said. They packed up and left without ever reaching the water. It happens. Antarctic engineering is brutal and failure is common. And yet And yet the timing sits oddly against the 2 successful drillings that same season. 3 nations, 3 lakes, 1 summer, 2 teams break through into the unknown. The third turns back at the threshold and never returns to finish. I am not saying they were stopped. I am saying the silence afterward was total and no one asked why. This is where the theory makes its most demanding claim, and I want to hand it to you carefully, because it is also its weakest point. If something extraordinary were being pulled from the ice, keeping it quiet would require agreement among nations that do not agree on anything. The United States, Russia, China, Britain, rivals watching each other constantly. How do rivals stay silent together? Under the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, those nations are legally entitled to inspect each other's bases. That was the whole point. Mutual transparency, no secrets, no weapons. On paper, Antarctica is the most surveilled continent on Earth, precisely because everyone is allowed to check on everyone. A coordinated cover-up there should be nearly impossible. So the theory does something clever, and I think you should watch it do it, because this is where speculation is doing the heavy lifting. It does not claim a single hand pulling strings. It claims something quieter, that no coordination is needed when every party already shares an interest in the same silence. Nobody has to conspire, everyone just declines to speak. Consider why each of them would stay quiet without ever being asked. A contamination result embarrasses the team that produced it. An unexplained organism invites years of skeptical review, and the framing everyone already uses, analog for extraterrestrial life, is far more fundable, far more publishable than we found something down here we cannot classify. The incentives align without a meeting. That is the elegant and unfalsifiable heart of it. A named conspiracy can be exposed, a shared reflex to look away cannot, because there is nothing to expose, only 1,000 small silences that happen to point the same direction. If that is what is happening, it would look exactly like ordinary institutional caution, which, I remind you, it very likely is. Let me be honest about how thin this can get. The 86% organism may simply be a database gap. The Willans and Vida discoveries are extremophiles, strange but unmistakably terrestrial, no aliens required. Ellsworth failed because Antarctic drilling fails. The quarantine is standard practice. Every single crack has a mundane, sturdy explanation, and any one of them is probably correct. The theory's only real move is to ask why all the mundane explanations line up so perfectly, every time, across every team, in the same direction. Individually, each is a coincidence. Collectively, the believer says, coincidence starts to strain. I do not know where the line sits between a pattern and a story the mind imposes on noise. Neither, honestly, does anyone. And there is an older layer beneath all this, one I approach reluctantly because it attracts the least careful minds. In 1946, the US Navy launched Operation High Jump, a genuine, documented military expedition to Antarctica. Thousands of men, ships, aircraft, led by Admiral Richard Byrd. That much is real history. Everything grafted onto it since is not. I raise it only because of what the modern theory borrows from it. The idea that Antarctica has, for the better part of a century, been the destination for expeditions far larger and stranger than the science alone would justify. High jump was almost certainly cold weather military training and mapping, but it seeded a suspicion that has never fully died, that the ice hides something worth guarding. So where does that leave us? You and me and a handful of sealed containers that may hold nothing but very ordinary, very old bacteria. I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable position. I cannot prove the theory. I cannot fully dismiss it either. And I have learned to distrust how satisfying total dismissal would feel. Here is the shape of what we actually know, stripped of interpretation. There are lakes beneath the ice. There is life in them, some of it hard to classify. There are institutions that handle that life with the same care they would give something from another world. And there is a silence around the strangest results that no one has ever had to organize. Everything past that line is theory, one possible reading of real facts, offered to you as a possibility and nothing more. I am not telling you experiments are being run on unknown creatures beneath Antarctica. I am telling you the ingredients for that story are all real, all documented, and all sitting quietly beside one another, waiting for someone to connect them. Maybe they should not be connected. Maybe the honest answer is that isolated ecosystems are weird, databases are incomplete, drilling contaminates, and secrecy is just embarrassment wearing a lab coat. That is the likeliest truth, and I would not argue hard against it. Most doors in a dark hallway open onto empty rooms. Most of them. But somewhere under 4 kilometers of ice that has not moved since before we were human, there is water we have barely touched, holding things we cannot yet name. And every year we drill a little deeper into it. I am not going to tell you what is down there. I am only going to tell you the drilling has not stopped.